Should we stop trusting Joyce about Finnegans Wake? Now, I'm being slightly eccentric and facetious when I say that, but there have been many statements that Joyce has made about his masterwork, some of which I think can be called into question. And one of the ways that we see this become a sort of intractable problem that has been cemented in the history of Wake criticism is the reliance on James Joyce's recording of the end of the Livia Plurabelle chapter. This was used as a sort of promotional material, and during the course of the drafting of Work in Progress, of what would become Finnegans Wake by 1939, this was often taken as a sort of breakthrough moment in which critics realized the musicality and the spoken nature of Joyce's words. They realize the extent to which it relies upon the lilting musicality that Joyce evoked in his recitation, and I find it really beautiful. However, I have seen a slight problem that I think has only become magnified in the way that this recording has been dealt with in the history of criticism, which is that it has been treated as of unique value in terms of determining the meaning and the appropriate nature by which we readers should be approaching Livia Plurabelle and therefore Finnegans Wake writ large.
Well, don't you ken it or haven't I told you, every telling has a tailing, and that's the he and the she of it. Look, the dusk is growing. My branches lofty are taking root, and my cold chair's gone ashen.
Peter Myers, in his The Sound of Finnegans Wake, has a chapter on Livia, the music of personality. And he says that from the beginning, Livia Plurabelle was conceived as a musical being. The colorful gossip of the washerwomen and the more or less incriminating accounts that occur throughout the wake gradually give her a kind of mutable flesh. But however substantial the reports may be, she contains a certain insubstantiality of sound. It would be easier to hum her than to paint her. And I think this is really well said. Oftentimes, entities like characters or setting or environment become primarily sonic in their qualities and are evoked in acts of readerly recitation. An act both of performance and also the interpretation that comes after that. And we as readers are challenged, how do we approach a text like this, a language for which we have no grammar textbook and no dictionary and no thesaurus, for which it seems like no learning is enough? No matter how many languages you know, you don't quite know the peculiarities that Joyce is invoking. And in fact, I'm really taken by Seamus Dean's preface to Finnegans Wake that's in the Penguin edition, where he says that Finnegans Wake forces the reader to pay attention to the various genealogies of words and their functions, how they are, in the most basic sense, composed of letters and combined into syllables, how they are heard and how they are seen, what historical weight and valencies they bear, what psychological, political, and social functions they perform, their proximity to and their distance from grunts and noises, their liberating and their repressive effects, their dependence upon syntax and grammar, and their capacity to generate meaning wildly and anarchically when freed from those systems of governance and communication. And one of those systems of governance and communication that Wake scholarship is still in the process of extricating itself from is that of Joyce himself. To what extent are we supposed to trust Joyce? And in fact, this is something that in the early history of Wake criticism, in the late 20s and early 30s, as versions of Work in Progress were being published, there were a lot of critics who were very skeptical, saying that Joyce is entirely pulling our legs as his audience, that this is a book for one, namely Joyce himself. So there's been some skepticism, and I'm not following that line of skepticism so much as I am calling into question the ability of the author to serve as an interpretive locus, and furthermore a performative locus for when it comes to looking at the various vocal, sonic, and musical aspects of Livia Plurabelle. Because over the course of my study of Finnegans Wake, I've always been very taken to this recording, and I'll continue to come back to it. And I found that throughout, there are parts that I'm really taken to. For example, the my back, my back, my back.
Oh, my back, my back, my back.
as well as the very end, where he very expertly renders these sort of fading echoes of the washerwomen as they grow apart and they become a stone and a tree. And they sort of become estranged from one another as sonically they dissipate al niente.
We'll meet again, we'll part once more. The spot I'll seek is the hour you'll find. My chart shines high where the blue milk's upset. Forgive me quick, I'm going, go by. And you pluck your watch, forget me not, your even load, so saved to journey's end. My sights are swimming thicker on me by the shadows to this place. I so home slowly now by own way, my valley way, tow I too, rat mine.
And he does a really good job of rendering that. And yet there are other parts of Anna Livia Plurabelle that I think Joyce does a somewhat moderate rendering of. And I think that there are much better versions of it. And of course, these are going to be bound by my subjective interpretations of what I think sounds good and what I think musically is being called for. And Myers investigates this a lot of exactly what is the nature of, for example, the river names that dot across the Anna Livia Plurabelle chapter, and charting some of the genetic history of how simple sentences gradually incorporated more and more river names in ways that maintain the original sense while adding on a panoply of additional senses. And this really gets one to ask, what is the role of us readers when we read Finnegans Wake? I think too often critics have relied upon Joyce's rendering vocally of this very short part. It's page 213 to 216 of the book. This is the very end of part 1 of 4. And I think that this has been used as a crutch. It's been used as a sense of surety. But we know that if we dig into the history of the development of the Wake, as well as Joyce's ideas about the Wake, he was far from sure about his kind of status as a specific indexing arch-modernist. Because when we take a look at the way that these high modernists have been depicted and the way that their aesthetics has tended to work, it is variegated and refined, right? It's all about the specificity of very minute moments and movements having extreme effects. One of my favorite examples, precisely because I didn't get it when I first read Ulysses, is Throwaway. And Throwaway is a mix-up that happens in Ulysses, one of the verbal mishaps that will explode to become the very fabric of his last work. And basically, Leopold Bloom has a newspaper, and a friend is asking what horse he should be betting on in the upcoming horse race. And there's some mix-ups verbally, some misunderstandings of what is being said, and Bloom tells his friend that he can keep the newspaper because he's going to throw it away. The friend mishears this and thinks that Bloom is telling him to put his money on the horse called Throwaway. And Throwaway is the dark horse. The Scepter is the one that everyone thinks is going to win. And yet Throwaway ends up winning. Now, Bloom being a Jew, there's a lot of anti-Semitism sort of latent within this dynamic of, oh, here's the conniving Jew who secretly knew, the fate of our monetary affairs, and he somehow knew what was going to happen. Now he has all the money. And basically this causes a whole slurry of problems to evolve, one of them being that Bloom doesn't accept a drink at the pub and also does not buy drinks for others, and is therefore presumed to be a greedy Jew because he has all this money and he's not paying for people. Look how standoffish he is with his money. And all of this stems from the smallest little misconception. And it's one that requires that you know things about the real world, that you can make this illusion between throw it away and throw away the horse. And all of these mishaps will sort of slurry around you, and you have no idea what is the confusion here. What are they even talking about? And then, you search through some sort of concordance or annotated copy, and before you know it, as I did, you find out that throwaway is a horse, and you figure out what is going on. The system sort of locks into place. And through these moments of realization, these sort of epiphanies allow for the system to come into confluence. And some theorists have talked about Finnegans Wake like this, that this is what puns do, and that we just need to decode all the puns, and we'll figure out all the discrete meanings, and we'll be able to get basically a wider picture. We can take a structuralist analysis, and we can figure out all the complicated dynamics, and complicated as they are, we can eventually figure out what Joyce was trying to say. But a lot of scholars, I think of Derek Attridge, for example, as well as Reuben Borg, who have theorized about the portmanteau in Finnegans Wake and pointed out that portmanteaus are very different than puns. Puns, for example, like smog, initially present one with meaninglessness, but once one figures out the sort of key, so to speak, you figure out the component parts that it is made up of, the simple, valid elements of everyday speech, smoke and fog, and you realize they're put together, and it sort of unlocks the unity of language, right? It reconfirms, once you unlock the pun, what's really going on, so to speak. And this bolsters the idea that the modernist aesthete has some sort of privileged perspective by which he can take the vast parts of the universe and synthesize it into some sort of whole. And Finnegans Wake is fundamentally opposed to that. It is, in fact, concerned primarily with problematizing its own wholeness. This is a book that is basically coming apart at the seams because it is questioning its own authorship. It is questioning the legitimacy of readers to be able to think coherently of concepts, or for characters to be properly unified, or to have genuine relationships with other people, or for there to be a coherent plot or narrative. All of these are being called into question such that the fixity that would supposedly be revealed by Joyce through these various mechanisms like puns is in fact done away with. And one of the ways that this has been accentuated by Attridge and Borg is that when we try to decode a pun, we often have to look to surrounding context, and we see that there are normal words surrounding this seemingly meaningless word, and through that context we can sort of break the mold. But the problem with the portmanteaus is that Finnegans Wake is filled with them. I mean, a significant amount, I don't know the percentage, I don't know if you could even do this, but a significant percentage of the book's context, of its very substance, is these portmanteaus, such that you don't have a susceptible normative context that you can draw from to figure out and unlock these portmanteaus. So there's a sort of indeterminacy of meaning that's latent here in the conception of the details of the book. And when we try to render this into speech, we find that we have to make a lot of decisions, in particular pronunciation decisions. But also you have to think about cadence, you have to think about your rhythm, you have to think about your pitch and tone. And all of these are going to play into how exactly we choose to render a passage. And the idea of rendering is really important, because rendering and interpretation are sort of two sides of the same coin, right? A rendering naturally yields certain choices that resulted from the indeterminacy of the text, which yields an interpretation. And also certain interpretations are going to be favorable to certain renderings. And when we listen to Joyce's recitation of the end of Finnegans Wake, there are a lot of things that come to the fore. For example, it has that classic Irish lilt.
Ping pang, there's the bell for sexualitis, a concepta de send spray. Pang. Bring out the clothes, ring in the dew. God avari vert the showers and grant thy grace. Amen.
It is what makes the language Irish, and we could say gives it a sort of national or ethnic stamp, so to speak. But in addition, it's concerned with the careful sonic contiguity and continuity and connections between words that yields a sense of progression, a sense of meaning, often a sense of, like proverbial value, like this is a common phrase, even though it's been transmuted into something unknowable. Also, there's a sense, and this is something Myers points out a lot, is the personality of the two washerwomen, which are the narrators of Anna Livia Plurabelle. They are vitriolic, filled with gall and chiding.
Oh, Runoko, what's your trouble? Is that the great Finn leader himself, in his joy kimono, on his statue riding the high horse there for Hengist?
They are often painfully concerned with what has been happening with Anna Livia Plurabelle. They're gossiping about her, and they're sensitive to the sort of strained matters of fact that are her life. They are also throwing around insults. They're engaged in strife and conflict. They talk about work and old age. So this is a chapter filled with a lot of personality, and it is, fundamentally hearkening to Ireland and to Dublin. So listening to Joyce recite it can be very helpful. But I would argue that it is also limiting. There are characteristic things that Joyce brings into this recitation that one may like or one may not like. One of the interesting things about Joyce's accent is the prominence of the r, of the trilled r.
Et concepta descendus praise. God of Ari, vert the showers and grant thy grace. Amen. Spread on your bank, and I'll spread mine on mine. A man and his bride embrace between them, else I'd have folded and sprinkled them only. I've heard tell that same brooch of the Shannons was married into a family in Spain, and all the dunders they're done in Markland's Vineland beyond Brendan's herring pool takes number 9 in Yanksee's hat.
Which a lot of modern Irish people might not use. This is typically a sign of sort of British dependence or upper classness that is seen as disfavorable or unnationalistic. For a lot of Irish brogues. And a lot of his choices can be very helpful and humorous.
Oh, Runoko, what's your trouble? Holy scamanders, I saw it again.
He'll have these very, you really feel the emotiveness in his voice. But then there are other ones that I personally just don't find nearly as compelling. Whereas I find other versions much more compelling in their rendering of certain phrases. For example, Siobhan McKenna's recitation of Anna Livia Plurabelle is just wonderful because she gets the dialogue format much better than Joyce does. She uses her voice acting abilities to render two distinct washerwoman voices, which Joyce kind of truncates into one soliloquizing monologue, which is fine, but I would argue that it doesn't really get across as well in Joyce's case the fact that this is a dialogue.
Oh, tell me all about Anna Livia. I want to hear all about Anna Livia. Well, you know Anna Livia. Yes, of course, we all know Anna Livia. Tell me all, tell me now.
Sometimes we get the sense that someone is calling and whatnot, but the distinctive two voices is brought out much better by Siobhan McKenna. And I think this is just one instance of many of the great recitations of Finnegans Wake you can find. I think of the Way Words and Mean Signs project. I also think of the Most Ever Company, who is in the process of doing a enacted version of Finnegans Wake. I've also done certain recitations of Finnegans Wake, not to necessarily place myself anywhere close to any of those other people. But the real point of this video is that rather than relying on Joyce's renderings of his text vocally as a sort of crutch, as we often see in criticism, I think it is high time that we as readers sort of take up our cross and bear it and delight in the fact that the indeterminacy of the text allows for us as readers to imbue it with unique vocal renderings, and it valorizes and in fact privileges the ability for the reader to make educated and creative and imaginative choices about the text. That is the reason that so much is left up to question and so much is left up to interpretation, is that Finnegans Wake valorizes the idea of performance and interpretation as interlinked, intertwined aspects of reading. And rather than just thinking about the text itself, The fact that the text is in front of us and the words are in front of us, but we have a hard time making meaning out of them, requires that we bring it into the vocal register and perform it. And when we do that, very oftentimes I will find that I want to experiment with an Irish accent, or a Russian accent, or an Italian accent, or an Iraqi accent, or some sort of random thing that might end up imbuing my recitation with unique, meaningful aspects that no others have yet. And I want to offer up that anyone who is curious in reading Finnegans Wake, or who is actively in the process of doing so, should consider it as spoken word, should consider that as a concomitant part of this physical thing that is the sort of inanimate words on the page. By making the word flesh through our own flesh, we are liberated as readers who control our experience. That being said, that's it for this video. I hope it's been somewhat helpful. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it really helps me out. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.